Thank you, Alexis, and thanks everyone for joining us. This is our latest installment of the Institute of the Americas Energy webinar series, and we're very pleased to be able to talk about Brazil today. We've spent several webinars over the last couple of months focused on Mexico, and surely many of you were with us last week talking about the electric sector in Mexico and the Bases del Mercado and the fascinating developments in the power sector in Mexico. Today, Brazil is on tap, and I don't think I probably need to mention this, but I will. Everyone online here clearly knows about the drought, the severe drought that's had a tremendous impact in Brazil and caused what, for many would agree, is one of the most challenging, if not toughest, energy crisis ever in Brazil, and it's been a crisis that's unfolded over the last several months, and even with a little bit of rain in February, still sees no distinct end in sight. Reservoirs that are at very low levels, and obviously Brazil has a highly touted hydro-dependent system. When it rains and when God is kind and brings rain to Brazil, the hydro system is a magnificent system for a variety of reasons, but in drought conditions, obviously that brings huge challenges. I don't want to go into all the other challenges that are going on in Brazil. We're going to talk about the power sector today. What happens when we face crises, and this is not unique to Brazil, but the word diversification comes out, and in the several years that we've been looking at Brazil, the word diversification seems to be much more on the tips of folks' tongues when you have drought conditions and the hydro sector is impacted. So again, we're talking about diversification. Brazil has made some efforts to increase natural gas generation, probably not as much as they would have hoped over the last several years, but in addition, the last few years have seen some important renewable energy auctions. Again, progress a little bit slower than probably hoped for, but there have been several efforts made to diversify the power generation matrix in Brazil, whether it be natural gas, whether it be some of the renewable auctions. But as the drought in the last several months remind us, Brazil's power sector is still one that gets severely impacted when the reservoirs are not at their optimal levels. Francisco, I don't want to keep going. One final comment I did want to make in the way of introduction was something that our speaker, who is the CFO of AES Brazil, hopefully will talk a little bit about as well, and that's the relevance of what's going on in Brazil's energy sector, power sector, and I've seen some interesting headlines where financing is now ever more expensive, and so you have, unfortunately, a system where the lower reservoirs, the drought impact, and the need for further diversification is also now being challenged by what's going to be higher costs to do business and develop projects. I see Francisco's presentation is up on the screen here, so why don't I just stop there and simply introduce our speaker, and that is Francisco Morandi, the CFO, of AES Brazil, and an old friend of the Institute and somebody who's worked at AES all the way back to the Electricidad de Caracas days, and I believe began with AES in the 90s in Caracas with AES's Electricidad de Caracas unit there, and now, like so many other folks from Electricidad de Caracas, has moved up into other places in AES. And we're happy to have him speaking to us from Brazil today. Francisco, AES is a wonderful steering group member, and you're a good friend. Thanks so much for taking time and sharing with us your thoughts on Brazil's power sector.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for such a kind introduction. Let me just test if you can hear me well.
I hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. So yes, I think the introduction you provide is it's very relevant. You know, we're living interesting times in Brazil, and we have been living those interesting times since a few years ago. And I will ask you to go to next slide to start talking a little bit. This first slide, I just want to make everyone understand, what is AES in Brazil. We are a player in the generation and distribution in Brazil. We are a hydro generation with AES Tietê. We have a 2,600 megawatts installed capacity, and it is our hydro facility that has been suffering significantly due to the lack of rain that we have seen, for several months already. We also own a thermal power plant, a combined cycle gas plant, AES Uruguayana, 640 megawatts plant located in Rio Grande do Sul state. That plant has also been in the news, put on the spot several times, as the gas that the plant worked with comes from Argentina. So we have been dispatching this plant during the emergency operations in 2013 and 2014, and we are actually dispatching the plant again through a bilateral agreement with the government of Argentina. And we also serve on the distribution side with AES Electropower. We serve the capital of the city with 6.7 million customers, and we also serve in Rio Grande do Sul state 1.3 million customers in AES Sul. So looking at our portfolio, we have been impacted by the crisis both in the generation side and in the distribution side. But let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit to put everything in the context of what we have been living. I think I will start on the top and consider that we have a very complex third tariff reset cycle, and this is for those of you that are not quite familiar with the Brazilian power sector. This is the process where the distribution company pays the regulator to get a tariff methodology for their next cycle, typically for 4 to 5 years. This third tariff cycle was in summary, squeezing significantly the distribution company's EBITDA margin. Just to put you an example, we went probably from around 2 billion reais of annual EBITDA to probably about half of that in Electropower, just to provide you an example. Then immediately after that, we suffered the MP 579, which is a provisionary measure that turned into law. And this was originally made to reduce a tariff for customers. And unfortunately, this MP 579 was put in place at a time where, after the hydrological challenges that we have been suffering, hydrology didn't play out well. And for companies like ours in the distribution side, we ended up in a cycle where we were facing, typically when you look at the distribution company tariff, it has embedded a cost of energy that has to do with the average cost that it's determined previously with the regulator. Due to the fact that the drought was in place, the thermal power plants were dispatched, and that cost of energy went skyrocketing, impacting our ability to manage the cash flow of these companies. The government put in place some funding mechanism trying to help through some funds that were available, including even using a loan provided to the clearinghouse of the electricity sector, the CCEE, that intervened trying to provide some cash flow support for the distribution companies. That, just to provide an example, you might be looking at cost of energy embedded in your tariff of, let's say, 200 reais per megawatt hour, and ultimately what you were really seeing were costs around 500 to 600 reais per megawatt hour. So the impact of this 300 reais per megawatt hour was needed to be swallowed by the distribution company, which typically in Brazil, they deal with the cost of energy, and it's reviewed on an annual basis. So 12 months after that, you will be recovering from that impact. That in itself creates a big issue in terms of how to finance the cash flows of the companies. We also saw some delays on tariff subsidies. Within the sector, we typically had a series of subsidies to provide support to the distribution companies that are providing tariffs, special tariff to low income levels. To kind of deal with that situation, they were put in place something that the government labeled as tariff flags, and these were mechanisms that were tagged to the electricity bill, started in January 1st, 2015. And what it did was basically trying to reflect that if the marginal cost of operation of the system was above a certain level, it means where the thermal power plants were dispatched, then the tariff will have embedded an increase, so the customer will start paying for the increase in the cost of energy. Recently, during March, the government put in place a new version of the tariff flag. We call it tariff flag 2.0. This is providing a better view of what the cost of the thermal power plants were and how that will be coming to the consumer. So the cash flow of the distribution companies were significantly improved. And then finally, we have an extraordinary tariff review that is reflecting the amount that the Itaipu cost of energy that is typically supplied to the distribution companies. For example, in the case of Electropaulo, about 25% of our energy is bought to Itaipu. It suffered in December 31st an increase of 46%. So that increase was so significant that we had required an extraordinary tariff review that the government and the regulator approve, and in general terms offer a 23.4% average increase to the final consumer. This is all being reflecting the situation of the situation we're living in terms of the hydrology crisis in the last 3 years. And if we go to next slide, I'm trying to show both the view of what are the levels of the Brazilian reservoir historically and how we look at the different years that we have been suffering within this drought period. And typically, we also show 2001 in the light gray line, because 2001 is a great reference, as it was the year that Brazil suffered a rationing process that put the country, the majority of the country, in a rationing period for many months. And as you can see, 2014, which is the red line, was really, at levels that were, very similar to what was happening in 2001. And I think I have to make the difference between 2001 and 2014. The reality is that, a whole thermal power set of plants were built, so the system is significantly more robust than what we have in 2001. But if we look at the different years, we have been suffering a series of lower than expected inflows in terms of average annual rain. And in 2012, for example, has been 87% of the long-term average. In 2013 was closer to 97%. 2014, 81%, and so far when we look at 2015, it's an average long-term average of inflow of 57%. So this is significantly low, and if you can see in the light blue dotted line, we're expecting to close March in 28% of the total level of the reservoirs for the total integrated system. And if we look at the right graphic, I'm trying to reflect here how the fluctuation within the different years we have seen in the records, and we're trying to compare from 2012 to 2015. And I think here what we're looking is the fact that historical levels, we have seen inflows lower than the historical level over the last 3 years. And if I actually drill down and look to a month-by-month analysis that is not in the slide, but we typically see here in Brazil, you look at January of this year, and it was the third worst January in history of hydrology, and we're looking at a history that started in 1952. So we have been facing months that are, among the top 10 worst inflows, which is, significantly worrisome, especially because if you look at the rainy season in Brazil, you must recall that it starts by the end of November and it ends by the end of April. So whatever you collect in your reservoirs until late April will be holding your dry season until late November of the next year. So if we look at the next slide, the question on everybody it's on top of their minds is, whether there will be rationing, whether is it possible to see a situation that will bring us back to 2001. I think, as I said before, here in the slide we talk about reservoir levels at 27.9%. I think we're today at 28.3% based on of yesterday's close. This is helping. The month of March is helping us increase our view that rationing could not happen. But if we look at the first graph, this is what we have been tracking down for the last weeks. We have a January 15 level of 21% of the integrated system reservoir. February of 2015 closed at 23%, and we expect to see March of 15 closing at 30%, indicated with what we have seen so far, only a few days to end on end of the month. And then we stop at March and we try to look at what could happen, between March and April, and we look at the different lines, and that is reflecting whether we get, a period between March and April that is, 60% of the long-term average, 70% of the long-term average, 80%, 90%, or 100% of the long-term average. And what we have in the color solid line is the different levels we can reach, at the end of April, which is, the highest, the end of the rainy season. So you can see in the first graphic that, we could have levels of between 31 to 40%, and this essentially will, pressure, the decision of whether or not there will be rationing. I think in our view so far, and we look at what the government is stating, and the Minister of Mine and Energy efforts are being put, is that we don't see there will be a rationing. We see and we are looking at a possibility of conducting what they call a rationalization scenario. And a rationalization scenario is basically betting on the fact that the increase in tariff plus a campaign alerting the consumers about the need to save energy will reduce demand, and that will help overcome some of the pressures on energy consumption. Also, we have seen some measures from the government trying to bring some emergency generation available at shopping centers and other large commercial and office buildings to be able to provide energy at the peak of the day, so that could also be provided to the system. We're a little bit skeptic in the total amount of energy that can be provided, as I think for the whole country should be probably around 3 gigawatts. And as you might recall, Brazil is a system that has an installed capacity of 133 gigawatts of energy. We look at a year that will keep spot prices at the top. Remember, you might recall that last year, spot prices were cut in half and we'll put at the top of 388 reais per megawatt hour. We expect that in this reality of, a level that starts in April between 31 to 40% reservoir level, you will see thermal dispatch all year long at levels between 16 and 17 gigawatt average, and that implies an estimated GSF generation scaling factor of between 0.83 to 0.85. And that, for those of you who are not familiar with this, this is indicating the amount of energy that the hydro system will be reduced to allow the thermal power plant to cover some of the needs of the customers, and at the same time, hold the levels of the reservoir. So, for example, GSF reduction in the case of the hydro companies is impacting directly my ability to generate energy. Going to the next slide, I think it's briefly presenting what is happening now to the whole system. Let's stop at looking at the hydro and think about this. We have been through few years of drought. We have a very tight hydrology. At the same time, we are looking at a system that is increasing its exposure to renewable energy, that it's ideal in a country that has the opportunity to take advantage of high capacity factor for wind projects, high solar irradiation, but at the same time is suffering the fact that the storage capacity of the system is being reduced. The ability to have hydropower projects with reservoirs that will allow the system to have more reliability is being reduced. So if we look at the left side of the slide, I'm talking about, how the storage capacity in number of months will be reduced for the future years, considering the expansion plan that the government has put in place and including all the already bid auctions that had happened. And then at the same time, on the right side, we start to look at, what is the consequence of this, tighter hydrology, lower storage capacity, and adding, more risk to the matrix, which implies, or should imply, higher prices. And if we look at the right side, I'm offering a view of how we were looking at prices for energy sold in 2016 in reais per megawatt hour, and how this price has evolved when I was originally selling energy by mid 2012. Price expectations for energy in the free market were around 100 reais, and now we're looking at prices of potentially closer to 350 reais per megawatt hour. So there is a process that is reflecting a more real cost of energy in Brazil. This is tied to the fact that the next megawatt that you're increasing to the installed capacity, that expansion marginal cost is being increased. That on the positive side is providing a more realistic and attractive return for new projects. But also at the same time, we, the players of the power sector, will need to consider, investments and costs as, capital for financing. It's being reduced, having probably a BNDES that is providing less support to the electricity sector, and due to the higher risk, we're also seeing higher interest rates for debt financing. So I think on the generation side, to finish this slide, I believe there are certain signs that there will be space for more attractive returns, and this would also, allow the energy matrix to be diversified. And I'll talk, a few minutes later on what's our view on what needs to come to the energy matrix to increase reliability. I think next slide, I will just quickly mention, there are a few things that the government put in place to restore the distribution companies' working capital. I think I went through some of them at my first slide, where I'll try to describe the series of unfortunate events that we live, and within 2012 and 13. Moving to next slide, I think it's the positive message that we can send, and the positive message of the distribution side is, there is a general sense that the fourth tariff review that the government is right now discussing, it's coming with a much more positive and realism component than the third tariff. And this is very important for the utilities, but also is very important for investors, for the sector, and in general for the analysts. The government has been clearly stating that there will be a better case for the utilities in the fourth tariff. That, for example, in the case of Electropaulo, will start in July of 2015. We have seen the government reacting positively, signaling a weighted average cost of capital of 8.09%, compared with 7.5 in the third cycle and 7.16, which was the original proposal that the regulator ANEEL put in place. Of course, if you ask me, would I like to see a higher number of weighted average cost of capital? Absolutely. I think if I look at the regulatory risk and I look at the exchange risk, I was expecting a walk, probably closer to above 9%. But our understanding is that the regulator is looking at this in a way that they can build up a case that will help the utility to rebuild their cash flow and the construction of the EBITDA. And there are a series of different factors that I'm presented in this slide, because ultimately, the weighted average cost of capital is really relevant, because that's how you remunerate your regulatory asset base. but there are other lines of revenue that could complement the revenue that can provide, and such as, special obligation assets, which is, having a fee on assets that are, built by the customer, or, increasing your productivity that will reflect in a larger EBITDA, in the case of Electropaulo, for example, and also bringing some, realism, as I said before, in terms of, recognizing the quality of service and technical losses standard. One thing is dealing with a reality in a city like Sao Paulo, and probably it's a whole different scenario if you're living, in the northeast of the country. And that also implies, having a better view in what a metro concession means. What does it mean to consider the maintenance of an underground network? What does it mean to consider, having the employees and personnel living in a large city? What type of labor liabilities you have that are, cost at a different base in every single city in the country. So this is very relevant for us. Some of other elements of, better understanding of O&M, and also the fact that the government, could recognize that, having a larger, higher tariff, which is the consequence of the increase of the cost of energy, will have a pressure in our ability to fight, non-technical losses, which is energy theft, but also the ability of the customer to pay, their energy bill. So recognizing the fact that bad debt levels could go up, it's important. And I want to make just a point here. Some of the customers that have seen their average income going up with all this positive effort that the last governments of Brazil had made in bringing more people to the middle class, it's also putting pressure, in this new middle class to be able to, pay their electricity bill and other bills. So the effort here for them in an economic situation that is very complex in terms of, unemployment and other factors is something that we're looking actively, because, higher tariffs could also mean, higher delinquency in some of the payments. So this is something that we would like the regulator to recognize, because it's part of the effort that we need to see, and it's part of the need we have to protect the cash flow of the companies, which ultimately it's very relevant not only for us, as operators of the companies, but also to investors that will have a clear, utility sector where they can invest in the long term as in any other place. Moving to next slide, I think this basically closing the cycle that we said in the first slide. We are sure that bringing a more realistic tariff, but also putting in place some emergency operations, things like we were looking at with the regulator, having the ability to bring some assets that are, available to support a system, also bringing new regulatory opportunities to our sector, such as being able to, facilitate the entrance of distributed energy. How can we, fastly bring a framework that will allow us to have generation closer to the load centers? And how can we, in companies as Electropaulo or others that play in the Brazil sector, will have a framework that will allow investments to have the right return, but also to have a response that is aligned with the emergency needs of the country. We have seen the government pushing forward new auction opportunities on the thermal side, on the solar side, on emergency generation, and there's openness from the government and the regulator to discuss, the attributes that these auctions need to have, thus, such as, better returns, the ability to have regulatory frameworks that have some flexibility. And we have seen coming opportunities in gas, in wind, in solar, maybe using the support of barges, distributed generation, and eventually bring in, some energy storage to support the emergency, but also have a system that is better prepared to face a crisis in the future. The next slide, it's what the plan for the government is so far, and if you look at the growth of capacity expansion in gigawatts, the energy matrix is seen to be growing, basically supported on hydro, wind, and some gas. And I think the government has been shy in adding gas to the energy matrix. You know, I remember the first time I saw these projections in 2010. There was no megawatts of new gas coming in the next 10 years. I think the advancement and the understanding that there is a need to bring firm energy to the matrix has changed the view of these projections. We believe at AES and in many of the associations we belong here in the power sector that there is a need to have gas playing an active role to firm up the energy sector. There's great wind capacity in Brazil, but wind needs to be firmed up. There's great solar capacity, but solar needs to be firmed up. And you know, combined cycle gas turbines are ideal for providing this type of support. We also believe that hydro will continue to have a space, but also on the flip side, hydro has had enormous problems to, you know, in regards with regards to permitting, environmental licensing, etc. So we want to see, and we believe there will be more space for gas in the future. And as I said in the next slide, you know, reliable energy is fundamental for Brazil. I think there's a common understanding in general terms of the main stakeholder that is, you know, required to firm up the system. But because we continue to see that facing a situation of drought, you know, thermal capacity could add on easily and in a better planned manner. And also, you know, on the other hand, that matrix expansion should reflect, you know, prices that are including, you know, the cost of the different new projects we're bringing. What is there as a challenge for the sector to bring more reliable energy? First is, you know, the confirmation of gas availability. So far, we continue to look at solutions considering, you know, natural gas, imported natural gas, LNG to Brazil. But we know there's this large development of pre-salt that will still need to be confirmed, the volumes of gas that will be available. And on the other hand, we think that there should be consistency between the energy prices offered in the auction and the type of returns we're expecting on the projects. And on a positive side, I think we have seen an improvement since last year in the expected returns. So this is positive because more players will be available to bring their projects to the future auctions that will happen, you know, in the future years. Next slide, it shows, you know, where we see there's opportunities in terms of shale gas and natural gas. You know, the efforts on shale gas have been slow. We are, you know, looking at some potential in some of the key areas that the government was pushing, especially, you know, the Parna Basin. And this gas is located, you know, close to the load center, so it will be a good solution for, you know, thermal power plants. Of course, you know, it takes a lot of time to develop these reserves. On the other hand, on the right side, you know, there's a significant challenge to have a more robust mesh, you know, or gas network in the country. This has been an element that has been a key success factor in the U.S., as all of you know, to you know, tackle the offering of shale gas. In the case of Brazil, that needs to you know, put in the agenda with more emphasis. This is something that will allow to bring, you know, lower cost gas that will, you know, be providing more of a logical cost of energy at the end. And my last slide, last but not least, I will not end without saying, you know, we are as AES, you know, positioned for growth in Brazil. If I look at the myriad of solutions we're bringing, you know, we think there's a space to provide more, you know, combustion and combined cycle gas plants. We believe that there's a space, an opportunity to continue working in renewables. We're very much looking at solar as a source that will be competitive. You know, in the case of solar, of course, there's a lot of things to be still defined. You know, whether there will be enough national component so we can have as player access to BNDES financing, which is the key you know, source of financing in the long-term project financing type of design in Brazil. And there's also the view that there are some peak load solutions. In the case of AES, We believe that energy storage will be a solution that can be brought to support on the peak load, and also eventually some emergency operations through barges operating in natural gas or oil could make sense to be prepared in the future in case some drought brings it's back in the reality of the country. So I end up here with a more positive view. I think the changes are being implemented. The last months have been very tough, but we continue to be positive that the right changes are being put in place. The government has been listening more to the companies and having a dialogue to try to bring as much as possible some of the changes that will bring back the utility sector to the level where it was before the beginning of the crisis. With that, Jeremy, I pass it to you for questions, if there are any from the participants.
Oh, that's great. Francisco, thank you. That was an extremely interesting presentation. I've got a couple things here. I know we've got some people who've dialed in on an audio bridge, so if those folks want to send questions via email to either Jeremy or Alexis, please do so, and we'll post them into that function. And just a reminder, as Alexis mentioned at the outset, there's an icon that has a little person with a question mark on the toolbar there on your lower right-hand side of the screen. Post your questions there, and that's what we'll use to have our question and answer session. Francisco's given us a lot of material here. And Francisco, as I listened to you, especially at the beginning, I remember something that I think it was Andy Vesey, who until late last year was the executive vice president of AES, and he said, "Pray for rain is not a national energy policy." So I think the hydrology is something that is just so dramatically important for Brazil. But I want to ask you first to start, as some folks pose questions here, I want to ask you a question that you talked about the 2001 crisis. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I heard you say because of how the country handled and some of the lessons from that crisis, especially in bringing online some emergency thermal plants, that it has actually cushioned and allowed for this current crisis to be not as profound. Could you talk a little bit about that? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I think that the fair comparison, when you look at 2001, there were about 3 gigawatts of thermal capacity to, support the system. And when we look at what has been built, we're right now, between 21 and 22 gigawatts. So it is indeed a more robust, thermal power sector that will help you deal with the drought situation. Someone could easily tell me, if you look at that now, you have almost all the thermal capacity being dispatched. So there's no much room to bring another, thermal power plant to support right now. And that's true. I think we're at a peak. But when I do the comparison, I have to give credit on this, ability to build up, a whole new set of plants. That said, there were few delays and few constructions that did not happen. So that also hurt us because, probably 3 to 4 more gigawatts should be online already, and they did not happen for many reasons.
Got it. Okay. Let me. I've posted a couple of questions we received, and I think folks are posting some more. Let me drag this onto the screen here. Francisco, this one starts off, and I think you mentioned this, but it's a question about non-technical losses, and hopefully you can see it. Essentially, the question is, what is the current situation vis-a-vis non-technical losses? Have they been reduced, and is it still a large drag on companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can speak for myself, and we have two companies, Electropaulo, which is in Sao Paulo. We have been in a very large history of fighting losses and trying to approach losses with a different angle. And we are, for example, at 9.8% of non-technical losses. But if you compare with some other places in Brazil that have a larger side of low-income population. I can remember companies that their non-technical losses level are at 40%.
Wow.
I think one of the positive sides of this is that the regulator, because one thing is the loss level you really have in your concession area, and the other is what loss level is recognized by the regulator. So some of these companies that face larger non-technical losses, the regulator is recognizing a larger portion, understanding the nuances of their concession area, which is something that I said in one of my slides. The more the regulator understands that you can be a player, like for example in my case, ASU has a very low level of non-technical losses. You can't compare the type of concession I have in outside of Porto Alegre with São Paulo. So as long as there's a recognition of that, there's a clear view of how you will proceed with losses and how you will fight losses. I think that makes the efforts on the utilities worthwhile, because ultimately you will make money as a company if you're able to fight the losses. But also at the same time, if you have a losses target that is irrational, it is probably worthless to try to fight and reach the levels that some companies have to face.
Absolutely. Let me thank you, and like you said, there's distinctions across the companies. Let's move to a related question that has to do with. I'm sorry. Let me drag this out here about energy efficiency. I think it's somewhat related in the sense we're talking about losses. Could you talk a little bit about energy efficiency and what's going on with energy efficiency in Brazil?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the issues that we were looking when the government started thinking about rationalization or rationing,
Yeah.
It was how much can you really improve in terms of energy efficiency, and how much will that bring to the final consumer in terms of having more efficient appliances, having more efficient light distribution at homes or offices. The country has improved significantly in that regard. I think one area where in general all the companies have been focused to is trying to improve public lighting, which is also one area that it's a good contributor of that. But I think I will put the country in a much better situation in terms of energy efficiency than what it was in the past. That said, the ability to really have some savings in a situation like this is not that significant. So it is a tool, but will not be a tool like it was in the past.
Okay. And just to be, I want to understand you when you talked about rationing. I understood you to say it looks like it will be avoided. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes. I think for example, what will happen if the system does not reach 30% in late April, or 15? I think it will be a political decision whether or not you will decree a rationing. I don't expect to see that the rationing will be decreed. In terms of formality, the rationing makes more sense for me because you will clearly be able to reduce your contracts, and that cost of energy will not be borne by you. But ultimately, I believe that the view of the government is that they could put in place some measures, and that's what they call rationalization.
Okay.
Sending their, for example, increasing. I have some customers that their tariff will go up on 40%. On top of that, there's a campaign to create conscious on consumption. That for sure will reduce, consumption from customers. So ultimately, that will be an effect from those campaigns. How big will that effect be? We don't know, because we have never seen tariff increases as the ones that we're facing in this time. And but I would say, answering your question, we don't foresee rationing happening at this time.
Excellent. I want to come back to that with there's a couple other questions, and thanks everyone. I'll do my best in the limited time we have to get to all the questions folks have submitted. Here's a question that I think is a perfect question for our speaker, the CFO from AES Brazil, and it talks about, and hopefully you can read it okay, Francisco, but it's talking about your views on how much more involved will domestic and foreign commercial banks and other providers of debt be in Brazil's generation sector. Basically asserts that without BNDES finance, hydro and wind are not technically feasible. But what are your views, especially as this person asked, in the midterm?
So this is an excellent question. I think it's something that is extremely relevant to us. We have seen signals from the government since the beginning of this second term of President Rousseff, but also before she was back in her position, that BNDES will reduce their financing to the sector. I think when we look at long-term financing in Brazil, it has been a challenge. When I think about participating in auctions, typically you have BNDES as the lender of last resource, but I would say it was the lender of it was the only lender of resource in long term. There will be a space in the near future for the so-called infrastructure debentures. Those are, debt instruments that will be available to the general public, and then we'll have some tax incentives. That could provide you, an opportunity to get financing for the long term. But, I think that people should review the way they bid in the auctions. Probably reconsidering BNDES financing and considering eventually that you will get less financing from BNDES in terms of the total debt that you could bring to a project, and that will open space for commercial banks entering eventually the arena of the long-term financing, and hopefully project finance, plain vanilla. Of course, if you look at the cost of financing nowadays, that will be a challenge. But I think we're living at a time where we're probably at the peak of the cost in terms of financing. This should, in the long term, reduce, and this will open the space for other players, with the support eventually from multilaterals to try to create a long-term financing market, because that's essential. I'm not saying that BNDES will not continue to finance, but I'm sure that interest rate that BNDES collects for their financial support will increase, and also the total amount committed to infrastructure sector will eventually be reduced.
Excellent, thank you. That's obviously very complicated. There's a couple of questions. I want to throw up a question that's very specific about some of the things you talked about with the thermal, and there's a very specific question about your insights or whatever you can say about the sale of assets envisioned by Petrobras, but specifically the thermo plants. And then after that, there's several questions about regional integration, and I'll bundle those into a wrap-up, a series of questions. But first, this question about Petrobras assets and thermal plant, perhaps, and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we understand that Petrobras is selling. It's had engaged advisors to sell some of their assets, some assets that they not consider strategic. After their recent review, the thermal fleet it's part of that portfolio to be sold. That's a process that should start very soon. In that portfolio there are assets that are really attractive, mainly built after the 2001 crisis. So I think many players will be looking at these assets to see whether it will be an acquisition that could be done on reasonable prices. The challenge always to buy a thermal power plant is that in this case you have the gas supply agreement, so that will simplify the story. But also you will need to have a bet of how much your asset will be dispatched, because remember that in Brazil thermal power plants are not base load; they're peaking plants. So you will have to had an hypothesis of how long in time they will be dispatched. But I think the answer to the question is yes. That asset sale, it's in the market, and many players are looking at it.
Excellent. Thank you. And obviously, we don't want to talk too much about Petrobras here because it could be, well, we're running out of time. That's a good reason. Let's end, as I noted, on the topic of regional integration, and you talked about it. And it's something, we were in Argentina last week for a roundtable, and our friends from GDF Suez made an interesting presentation with 11 different scenarios on how to revive, as it were, what is a lot of infrastructure for regional integration. I'm going to put up one of the specific questions about regional integration, and let me add to this. There was somebody who had a more general question and wanted to get your insights on where we stand in terms of regional integration. And then there was another specific question about what the role of the future regas terminal in Uruguay, as well as Bolivian gas, will mean for Brazil. And then, as the one I put up on the screen talks about imports of electricity from Argentina and Uruguay. That's a specific question about that arrangement, but use that question and then talk more broadly about the regas in Uruguay, gas, the Bolivia to Brazil gas pipeline, and some of the other things in terms of your thoughts as to where we are and where we could be for regional integration.
Great. Now, regional integration is one of my passions here, trying to see how this will become a win-win. I think on the specific question about importing electricity from Argentina and Uruguay, yeah, that was confirmed. It's in the newspaper, I think today. We have seen that exchange of energy between Brazil and Argentina before, and it makes sense also with importing with Uruguay. I think Brazil, as I said before, is trying to avoid the rationing, and they are considering all the different sources that could provide additional energy to be part of the equation, between now and eventually the beginning of the new rainy season in late November of 2015. I think the talking about the Uruguay LNG project, I know that you guys talk a lot about that. I have heard GDF folks commenting on that. I think, any opportunity to bring, a natural gas to Brazil will be considered as a positive one, will contribute to the energy mix. I think that, the complexity of that is probably how to bring that, from Uruguay to Brazil, and ultimately make it competitive. But we have seen studies that consider that option as a solution to provide energy in Brazil. Bolivia Brazil is also another relationship that continue to be relevant for the country. The volumes there are meaningful for Brazil. This could complement again, not only in this case some of the recent supply. There were plants that were obtaining, gas from Bolivia, like the asset that Petrobras run, Cuiabá. But also in the long term, there could be more availability of gas. Of course, remember that gas contracts will be renegotiated in the future. I can't remember exactly what date, but it will be a discussion on price. And I think in terms of integration, we at AES have an excellent example, because when we are talking to the government of Brazil in terms of looking at having Uruguayana, for example, in the long run. And Uruguayana is an asset that gets its gas from Argentina. Argentina typically can send gas during the summer, but eventually during the winter, Argentina has constraints, that you all know, because that gas is used for domestic heating. So that the continuity of supply of gas for a plant like Uruguayana, it's constrained by that reality. Recently, we at Chile completed the interconnection between Chile and the transmission interconnection between Chile and Argentina. So discussions that we were having, including the idea of having electricity in Argentina coming from our generations plant in Chile, being able to equate, in gas that will eventually return into electricity in Brazil with Uruguayana. So having the flexibility not only to have gas networks but also transmission networks will definitely complement and create a win-win for all the countries that could be part of this integration. Having a regulatory framework that allows those permits and those energy exchange are very reasonable. I think that, for example, in the case of Chile and Argentina, it took a long time to have those frameworks in place. Brazil and Argentina have a bilateral framework in place that allow them to take advantage of those exchanges. But I think in general, looking at the long term, maybe one thing that everybody should focus on after the emergency is probably thinking and having a framework that allows more flexibility for energy exchange in the future for the South American region. That is definitely looking at this type of situation with drought hitting many countries. It's not something that it's only related to one country in particular. So thinking big in terms of energy integration will be a win-win for all the participants.
No, I couldn't agree more. And obviously, at the Institute, integration is one of the things we've been working on, whether it's in Central America, the Southern Cone, or the entire hemisphere. Our friend John Foreman has put on the chat that the Bolivia-Brazil pipeline, he put 2019, so I assume that means in 2019 is when the current agreement will have to be renegotiated and renewed. So thank you for that, John. And I just want one comment about you talked about the constraints in Argentina, and having been there for our roundtable last week, there's a huge amount of optimism that there will be a major overhaul in energy policy in Argentina when the new government takes over. So perhaps some of those constraints and some of the things that you talked about that are holding back regional integration and reviving regional integration, whether it be in Brazil, whether it be in Argentina, maybe 2016 could really be a year that some of those constraints are lifted, and we see all the countries of the region re-embrace what frankly is a lot of existing infrastructure. There's a lot of infrastructure that is ready to be tapped.
Absolutely, absolutely. We specifically at AES, we own more than 3,000 megawatts in Argentina, and Argentina is a very important country for our Latin America strategy. So we're always optimistic. We're an eternal optimistic company in Argentina, and certainly we're sure that all those gas developments will happen in the future, and this will be an important source for the whole region.
Well, no wonder we always get along so well. I'm the eternal optimist, and we at the Institute are the eternal optimists as well when it comes to the hemisphere and Latin America's energy sector. So with that, I want to remind folks to join us again online, or better yet, in person. April 9th, we'll be having discussions of the electric sector in Mexico. Obviously, energy reform in Mexico is a big issue. We're going to focus on the electric sector and electric side of that reform. April 14th, another webinar. Our friends at BP will deliver the part of their energy outlook that focuses on North America. And then this will be our 24th annual La Jolla Energy Conference here in La Jolla, California, May 20th and 21st. And then June 23rd, we're planning a roundtable in Santiago, Chile, to talk about the energy agenda of the Bachelet government 1 year on and some of the latest developments there. Francisco Morandi, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. As Alexis mentioned, we have recorded this, and we will get this out to everyone online. Thanks for everyone's comments. Very much appreciate your participation. Francisco, thanks again. Hope to see you in person again soon.